On March 14, 1849, the county courthouse in Lowndes County, Alabama, was consumed by fire in what officials formally attributed to a tragic mishap caused by an overturned lamp. Yet, beneath the rubble, investigators uncovered evidence that contradicted the official narrative. 3 sets of human remains discovered in the basement, each chained to heavy iron rings embedded in the stone walls. The county clerk's comprehensive records spanning from 1847 to 1849 were entirely destroyed, along with property deeds, marriage certificates, and, most critically, the probate documents pertaining to the Sutton estate. For well over a century, descendants of Lowndes County families have privately shared hushed stories about the true events that transpired at Bell River Plantation during those 2 years, stories involving the twin daughters of Colonel Nathaniel Sutton and a slave named Marcus who somehow managed to meticulously record everything before he vanished without a trace. The narrative you are about to hear has been meticulously reconstructed from a collection of surviving personal letters, medical records sourced from Mobile, and testimonies given to a Northern Abolitionist society that remained sealed until 1963. Before we proceed with the story of the Sutton sisters and the dark secrets that engulfed an entire community, ensure you are subscribed to Liturgy of Fear and have activated that notification bell. We are dedicated to uncovering the darkest corners of American history that textbooks often omit, and please leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We cherish knowing where our audience discovers these forgotten horrors. The truth about Bell River Plantation begins not with the devastating fire, but with a funeral that took place 2 years earlier, and with 2 women who had been rigorously trained that absolute control was the only path to survival. Lowndes County in 1847 spanned some of the most fertile cotton-growing terrain in Alabama. Rich, dark soil that generated enormous wealth for men and carved the landscape into veritable kingdoms of white-columned mansions surrounded by fields stretching to the horizon. The county seat of Hayneville was the hub of this activity, a cluster of brick structures and unpaved roads where planters conducted their business and their wives maintained the pretense of ignorance regarding the true source of their family's prosperity. Bell River Plantation was situated 8 miles south of town, accessible exclusively via a private road that meandered through groves of water oak and crossed 2 tributaries of the Alabama River. Colonel Nathaniel Sutton constructed the main house in 1828, a sizable 3-story residence featuring 12 rooms and a separate kitchen structure, connected by a covered walkway. The slave quarters, comprising 24 cabins arranged in 2 exact rows, were located a quarter-mile behind the main house, close enough for quick summoning but sufficiently distant that the colonel wouldn't have to endure the sounds of the lives he claimed to own. The colonel had accumulated his fortune from cotton, yet his notoriety stemmed from something entirely different. He had served in the Creek War under Andrew Jackson, and returned from that conflict with a deeply entrenched belief that human beings could be selectively improved through careful breeding, mirroring the way one enhanced livestock. His personal library held medical textbooks from Philadelphia, agricultural journals imported from Virginia, and private correspondence with academic men who shared his rigid convictions about racial hierarchies and biological destiny. He maintained fastidious records, measurements, detailed observations, and genealogies meticulously traced back 3 generations. His neighbors generally regarded him as eccentric but brilliant. His slaves referred to him by a term entirely different, though never within earshot of white individuals. The colonel never formally married. Instead, in 1824, he purchased an enslaved woman named Ruth from a Charleston trader, a woman noted in the bill of sale for her uncommonly fair complexion and Gentile bearing. Ruth bore him twin daughters in 1825, whom he named Sarah and Catherine. The colonel raised the girls within the main house, provided them with a thorough education via tutors from Mobile, and dressed them in expensive clothing ordered from New Orleans, yet he never legally freed them. He never legally acknowledged them as his own daughters in any official document. On paper, they strictly remained his property, an arrangement that afforded him absolute control over every single facet of their existence. Sarah and Catherine grew up in a very peculiar state of isolation. They mastered reading and writing, learned to paint watercolors, and played the pianoforte. They studied literature, mathematics, geography, and French. However, they were rarely permitted to leave the plantation grounds, The colonel strictly controlled who could visit and when, screening every potential social acquaintance according to his own rigid standards. He constantly told them they were special, claiming they had been given advantages that elevated them above their station, but that the external world beyond Bell River would never truly understand or accept them. He instilled in them the belief that safety was found only in seclusion, that trust was a fundamental weakness, and that power, regardless of its limitations, was the only currency that truly mattered. The twins absorbed these harsh lessons too deeply. They developed their own private language of subtle glances and gestures, frequently finishing each other's thoughts, sometimes communicating for days only through quiet notes passed back and forth across the dinner table. They wore identical dresses, color-coordinated, Sarah in deep green, Catherine in midnight blue. They read the same books at the same pace, with one starting at the beginning and the other at the end, meeting precisely in the middle. They shared everything: hairbrushes, fine jewelry, all their most guarded secrets, and eventually something far more sinister. Their mother, Ruth, died in 1839, officially recorded as pneumonia, though whispers from the slave quarters spoke of prominent bruises on her arms and a crippling fear in her eyes during her final weeks. After her death, the colonel's grip on his daughters tightened like a coiled noose. He installed locks on their bedroom doors that could only be opened from the exterior. He demanded they submit weekly written reports detailing their activities, their thoughts, and even their dreams. He began testing them, leaving valuable items in plain sight to gauge whether they would steal, introducing them to selected male visitors to observe their unguarded reactions, fabricating situations designed specifically to expose any hidden acts of rebellion. The plantation itself thrived during these years. By 1847, the colonel owned 63 enslaved people whose labor yielded 142 bales of cotton annually. He sold his crop through agents in Mobile and reinvested the substantial profits into acquiring more land, more slaves, and more books for his ever-expanding library. The slave population at Bell River possessed an unusual demographic profile: a disproportionately high number of light-skinned individuals, more children than the calculated birth rate should have produced, and a disturbing trend of families being separated and sold away, just as the children reached adolescence. The overseer, a man named Jonas Pritchett, had worked at Bell River for 15 years. He resided in a small cottage near the slave quarters and executed the colonel's orders with emotionless, mechanical precision. Pritchett maintained his own meticulous records, logs of punishments administered, work crew assignments, and detailed dietary restrictions for slaves the colonel had designated for his breeding program. These notebooks, written in Pritchett's dense, cramped handwriting, documented horrific atrocities with the casual tone one might use for farming reports: which women were forcibly moved into which cabins, which children were sired by which men, which pregnancies were intentionally terminated, and by what methods. Inside the main house, Sarah and Catherine understood far more than their father ever realized. They regularly read his private journals when he traveled to Mobile on business. They eavesdropped behind doors and carefully gathered fragmented conversations between Pritchett and the colonel. They knew precisely what occurred in the quarters after nightfall. They knew which of the slaves were their own half-siblings. They were fully aware that their father viewed human beings as disposable experimental subjects in his personal laboratory of racial theory, and they nurtured a cold, patient fury that would have terrified him if he had ever recognized its existence. The morning of February 3, 1847, dawned with unseasonable warmth, temperatures climbing into the low 60s even before noon. Colonel Sutton had spent the previous night in his study, working late by lamplight on correspondence intended for a professor at the Medical College of South Carolina. The household staff initially failed to notice anything unusual when he did not appear for breakfast. He frequently worked through the night and slept late into the morning. It was Pritchett who discovered him at 10 o'clock, slumped lifelessly in his large leather chair with papers scattered across the desk. The colonel's face was a grayish hue, and when Pritchett reached out to wake him, the skin felt strikingly cold and waxy. Dr. Amos Grayfield arrived from Hayneville 2 hours later and officially pronounced Colonel Nathaniel Sutton dead, estimating the time of death as sometime between midnight and dawn. "Hard seizure," Dr. Grayfield declared dismissively, barely looking at the body. Man was 56 years old, worked himself to sheer exhaustion, I'd warned him about his choleric temperament and excessive mental strain. The heart simply gives out. Simple as that. However, several crucial details did not align with this convenient diagnosis. The colonel's dinner tray, which had been brought to the study at 8 the previous evening, sat undisturbed on a side table with the food barely touched. A cup of coffee, long since gone cold, showed a peculiar residue at the very bottom, a fine sediment that glittered faintly under the lamplight. The colonel's final correspondence, addressed to his attorney in Mobile, was abruptly cut off mid-sentence. I have made certain arrangements regarding the future of my daughters, which must be executed precisely as stipulated for their own protection and for the preservation of my life's work. Should any person attempt to— The sentence ended there, the pen mark trailing off the edge of the paper as if his strength had instantly failed. Sarah and Catherine stood together in the hallway just outside their father's study, dressed in matching black mourning dresses they had somehow acquired despite having no advance notice of his death. Their faces were devoid of tears, showing no trace of shock or grief. They held hands, their fingers tightly interlaced, watching the proceedings with identical expressions of cold, watchful calm. "We should examine him more carefully," suggested Mr. Harold Breenage, a neighboring planter who had arrived to offer condolences. "Nathaniel was in excellent health last month when I saw him at the courthouse. This seems rather sudden." "The colonel worked himself into the grave," Dr. Grayfield snapped, clearly annoyed at having his professional judgment questioned. "I've witnessed it 100 times. The body simply gives out. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to speak with the daughters about funeral arrangements." But Dr. Grayfield never initiated that conversation. Sarah addressed him first, her voice perfectly controlled and cold as January rain. "Dr. Grayfield, we appreciate your prompt attendance. The funeral will be held 3 days hence with burial in the family plot. Mr. Jeremiah Osgood, our father's attorney from Mobile, has been summoned and should arrive by tomorrow evening. Until such time as the will is read and the estate settled, Catherine and I will manage the plantation affairs. Pritchett will continue as overseer under our direct supervision." The men in the room exchanged surprised glances. Women did not manage plantations, certainly not unmarried women barely 22 years old. And there was something else, a quality they couldn't quite name, a powerful sense that Sarah and Catherine had been waiting for this moment, that they had rehearsed these exact words and knew precisely how subsequent events would unfold. "Now, Miss Sarah," Mr. Breenage began in the condescending tone men typically used when discussing complex matters with women, "you can't seriously expect to— Our father educated us specifically for this eventuality," Catherine interrupted, her voice a precise echo of her sister's. "We fully understand crop rotation, market factors, and the management of field labor. We have studied his methods for years. This plantation will continue to operate at its current level of productivity." What the men did not know and could not have known was that Sarah and Catherine had been preparing for this day for many months. They had meticulously studied their father's account books, memorized the names and capabilities of every enslaved person on the property, and learned which merchants in Hayneville could be manipulated and which needed to be carefully avoided. They had planned for every possible contingency except one: the specific contents of their father's last will and testament. The funeral took place on February 6th under heavy gray skies that promised rain but never actually delivered. 43 neighbors and business associates attended, gathering solemnly in the parlor where the colonel's body lay in a walnut casket lined with white satin. The Reverend Samuel Yates from Hayneville's Presbyterian Church delivered a eulogy that praised the colonel's contributions to Alabama's agricultural prosperity and his dedication to advancing scientific knowledge. Not a single enslaved person from Bell River attended the formal service, though they gathered privately in the quarters that evening for their own ceremony, a powerful mixture of Christian hymns and older traditions, singing songs that celebrated liberation and the settling of ancient debts. They kept their voices low, but the sound carried across the fields to where Sarah and Catherine sat on the main house veranda. "They think they're free now," Sarah said softly, gazing out at the dark horizon. "They'll learn differently," Catherine replied with certainty. Jeremiah Osgood arrived from Mobile the evening after the funeral, a portly man in his 50s with silver hair and the cautious demeanor of someone accustomed to delivering bad news to wealthy clients who could make his life difficult. He carried a leather satchel containing Colonel Sutton's will and several sealed documents explicitly marked, "For the twins' eyes only." The will reading occurred in the colonel's study, which had been thoroughly cleaned of any evidence from his final hours. Sarah and Catherine sat closely together on a settee, their black mourning dresses rustling faintly as they adjusted their positions. Pritchett stood silently by the door, uninvited but tolerated, his weathered face expressionless. Osgood opened his satchel and retrieved a thick document tied with a black ribbon. "Colonel Sutton revised his will on December 12, 1846, Osgood began, less than 2 months before his death. The provisions are somewhat unconventional. The document's opening paragraphs contained standard charitable bequests to the Presbyterian Church and personal items distributed to various acquaintances. Then Osgood reached the section concerning the plantation and its inhabitants. To my daughters Sarah and Catherine Sutton, I leave the entirety of Bell River Plantation, including all lands, structures, livestock, equipment, and human property, to be held jointly and equally between them. However, this bequest is strictly conditional upon the following stipulations, which must be fully satisfied within 24 months of my death." Osgood paused, clearing his throat uncomfortably, and continued. "First, both daughters must enter into lawful Christian marriage with men of suitable character and standing approved by the executive of this estate. Second, both marriages must produce legitimate offspring within the stipulated time frame. Third, the daughters must maintain the plantation at current levels of productivity and demonstrate sound management of its resources." Sarah's hand tightened sharply on Catherine's, their knuckles turning white. "Should these conditions not be met," Osgood read, his voice dropping lower, "Bell River Plantation and all its assets shall be sold at public auction, with proceeds distributed equally among the following charitable institutions." The list included agricultural colleges, medical societies, and organizations dedicated to the advancement of scientific understanding of human populations. The colonel's final attempt to ensure his disturbing ideology outlived him. "There's more," Osgood said, withdrawing a second document. "A private letter addressed to you both." He handed the sealed envelope to Sarah, who broke the wax seal with her thumbnail. Inside, their father's tight handwriting covered 3 pages of heavy cotton paper. Catherine leaned close, and they read together in silence. The letter explained the colonel's rationale with chilling clarity. He had observed their unnatural attachment to each other, their utter rejection of normal feminine interests in courtship and marriage. He had concluded they would never voluntarily separate, and never form appropriate alliances with men who could continue his twisted work and properly manage his estate. Therefore, he had manufactured a situation where they had no choice: marry and procreate, or lose absolutely everything. But the letter's final paragraph contained something far more sinister. "I have made arrangements to ensure you choose wisely. My network of correspondence extends throughout the state and beyond. They will be watching, reporting back on your conduct and your choices. Remember always that you are what I made you, and you cannot escape the fundamental truth of your nature no matter how you might pretend otherwise. The blood that flows through your veins is both your privilege and your prison." Sarah carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. When she looked up at Osgood, her expression betrayed nothing. "We understand the terms. Who serves as executive?" "I do," Osgood replied, along with Mr. Breenage as co-executive. "We're charged with approving any marriage proposals and ensuring the conditions are met." 24 months, Catherine stated, calculating quickly. "That gives us until February 1849. "Correct. I must say, ladies, your father's provisions are highly irregular. Most attorneys would have counseled against—" "Our father's mind was entirely his own," Sarah interrupted curtly. "We will comply with his wishes. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have plantation business to attend to." After Osgood departed, promising to return in 6 months to gauge their progress, the twins remained in the study. They took possession of their father's chair, Catherine sitting on the seat and Sarah perched on the armrest, surveying the walls lined with journals and medical texts, and the ledgers documenting 2 decades of human experimentation, disguised as agricultural management. "We cannot possibly find suitable husbands in 24 months, Catherine stated finally. He knew that. He engineered this to fail. "Not if we control every variable," Sarah countered. "Father taught us that much. He believed humans could be bred like livestock, that every aspect of reproduction could be managed and directed. We'll prove him right, just not the way he intended. What exactly are you suggesting? Sarah rose and walked to their father's desk, pulling open the bottom drawer where he had stored his most confidential records. She withdrew a leather-bound journal and flipped it open to a page marked with a silk ribbon. Father's breeding logs, she stated. He documented everything. Which combinations produced which results, which bloodlines he considered superior, and which individuals he specifically designated for his program. Catherine joined her, reading over her shoulder. The entries were clinical and dehumanizing, describing people as if they were nothing more than cattle. Purchased male, approximately 25 years from Williamson Estate. Good teeth, strong back, quick to learn tasks. Letters visible on back indicate prior ownership in Virginia. Paired with female number 4. Results: 1 male child sold 1837, 1 female child, retained for future breeding. He was a monster, Catherine whispered, horrified. He was, Sarah agreed, but he was also thorough, and somewhere in these meticulous records is the solution to our problem. Over the ensuing weeks, Sarah and Catherine fully immersed themselves in their father's extensive documentation. They quickly discovered the complete scope of his twisted obsessions: journals spanning 20 years, detailed genealogies, precise physical measurements, and observations on temperament and capability. He had consistently treated Bell River as a living laboratory, its enslaved population as experimental subjects, all in service of his dark theories about racial hierarchies and human improvement. But within that documentation, they found something wholly unexpected: clear evidence of intelligence, resilience, and resistance among the very people their father had attempted to reduce to mere data points. Slaves who had taught themselves to read despite strict prohibitions. Women who had secretly used herbs and folk knowledge to control their own fertility, quietly subverting the Colonel's inhumane breeding program. Men who had deliberately sabotaged equipment and slowed productivity in ways that were made to appear purely accidental. Their father had noted these deficiencies in output without ever recognizing them as genuine acts of rebellion. One name appeared repeatedly in the later journals, always accompanied by annotations of deep frustration: Ruth, their mother. The Colonel had purchased her expecting a compliant bearer of children for his experiments. Instead, he found a woman who resisted him in subtle, persistent ways, teaching her daughters to read when he was away, quietly whispering to them about the free life she'd known before slavery, planting seeds of doubt about his absolute authority. She tried to protect us, Catherine said softly, tracing her finger over their mother's name in the ledger, even when she couldn't save herself. Then we owe her more than simple survival, Sarah replied with cold resolve. We owe her victory. But victory required resources, time, and one final element they didn't yet possess: a man they could control completely, whose presence would satisfy the letter of their father's will, while entirely violating its spirit. The potential solution arrived in late April, although they didn't recognize its significance immediately. The spring slave auction in Hayneville drew sellers and buyers from across central Alabama, transforming the courthouse square into a grim marketplace of human misery. Enslaved people stood exposed on a raised platform while white men examined them like livestock, checking teeth and muscle tone, asking intrusive questions about their work history and health. The air was thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and pervasive fear. Sarah and Catherine attended the auction with Pritchett, ostensibly there to purchase additional field hands for the expanded acreage they planned to cultivate. They wore black veils, still observing mourning, which provided them anonymity in the large crowd and allowed them to observe closely without being closely observed in return. The morning sales proceeded predictably. Field workers sold to large plantation owners. Domestic slaves sold to town families, and children agonizingly torn from their parents and sold to different buyers. Then, shortly before noon, something distinctly unusual appeared on the auction block. Next lot, the auctioneer called out loudly. Property of the Granville estate, recently deceased. One male, age approximately 28, name of Marcus. Got his letters? A thinker. Worked as a house servant and tutor to the Granville children. No history of rebellion, no attempts to run. Starting bid, $1,000. Marcus stood on the platform with exceptionally straight posture and a level gaze that was neither openly defiant nor completely submissive. He wore clean but worn clothing, and his hands, The hands of someone who worked with ledgers rather than cotton showed no calluses. His skin was several shades lighter than most of the people sold that morning, suggesting mixed ancestry. But what instantly captivated Sarah's attention was something else entirely. The way he scanned the crowd, not with the defeated resignation she expected, but with clear calculation, as if he was evaluating his potential buyers just as closely as they were evaluating him. "Educated slaves are a risk," someone in the crowd shouted. "Gets ideas above his station. Perfect for a household that needs bookkeeping done," the auctioneer countered smoothly. "How many of you can truly balance your own accounts? Here's a man who can do it for you. Now do I hear 1,000? The bidding opened slowly. Most planters emphatically did not want an educated male slave. Too much potential for trouble, for reading abolitionist newspapers, for forging travel passes. But a few town merchants showed hesitant interest, seeing the value in someone who could manage their stores or handle correspondence. Sarah leaned close to Pritchett and spoke clearly. "Bid. Miss Sarah, we don't need—" Pritchett began, confused. Pritchett raised his hand and bid. 1,000. 1,200, countered a merchant from Montgomery. 1,300, Pritchett called out firmly. The bidding slowly climbed until it reached $1,600 before the Montgomery merchant dropped out, shaking his head at the inflated price for a single male slave, educated or otherwise. Sarah had willingly paid more than market value, a fact that was certain to generate gossip in the coming weeks. Marcus was delivered to Bell River 3 days later, walking the 8 miles from Hayneville with his meager possessions in a cloth bag. Pritchett met him at the plantation entrance and led him directly to the main house where Sarah and Catherine waited in the study. "You can read and write," Sarah stated. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." Marcus's voice was educated and carefully neutral, revealing nothing of his inner thoughts. "You tutored the Granville children. What did you teach them?" "Reading, writing, arithmetic, some geography and history, whatever their father requested, ma'am." Catherine slowly circled him, appraising his bearing. "The Granvilles were known abolitionists, Quakers, I believe. They allowed their slaves to be educated." For the first time, something flickered in Marcus's eyes, perhaps weariness, or the recognition that this conversation was far more complex than it seemed. "Mr. Granville believed all people possess souls and minds worthy of development, ma'am." "And you?" Sarah asked directly. "What do you believe?" "I believe I'm standing in front of 2 women who paid too much for me, and who clearly have something very specific in mind beyond mere field labor." The twins exchanged meaningful glances. Their father had conditioned them to view enslaved people as objects, inherently incapable of sophisticated analysis or autonomous thought. Marcus had just demonstrated both within 30 seconds. "We have an unusual situation," Sarah began carefully. "Our father died recently, leaving conditions on our inheritance that demand creative solutions. We need someone educated, discreet, and capable of understanding highly complex arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" Marcus asked, his gaze steady. "The kind that must remain entirely private within this household," Catherine replied. "You will live in the main house, not the quarters. You will have access to our father's extensive library. You will be treated well, fed properly, and granted freedoms that would be extraordinary anywhere else. But in exchange, you will do exactly what we instruct, when we instruct it, without question or hesitation." Marcus remained silent for a long, calculating moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. "And if I refuse these unnamed terms?" "Then you will be sold south," Sarah said flatly, the threat unmistakable. "To cotton plantations in Mississippi, where educated slaves are deliberately worked to death in the fields to break them of any intellectual pretensions. I can have you on a boat within a week." It was not an empty threat, and Marcus clearly recognized the danger. "What do you want from me?" "That depends," Catherine said, stepping forward. "Can you keep secrets?" "Even ones that could potentially be used as weapons." "I've kept secrets my entire life, ma'am," Marcus replied simply. "Had to survive." Sarah walked to the window, looking out across the vast plantation grounds. "Our father's will requires both of us to marry within 24 months or lose everything. But we have absolutely no intention of submitting to marriages arranged by men who fundamentally view us as property to be managed. So we are going to subvert the terms while technically fulfilling them." "I don't understand." "You will," Catherine said. and a dangerous, almost feral expression crossed her face. We are going to marry men we can control completely. Elderly men or sickly ones or men desperate enough for the connection to a wealthy plantation that they will agree to any private terms we dictate. Men who will provide us with legal legitimacy without any real interference in how we run Bell River. And the children? Marcus asked, though the horrifying implications were starting to dawn on him. Biology is biology, Sarah said bluntly. Our father spent 20 years attempting to prove that lineage can be strategically managed. The executives only need to see the marriages and the subsequent pregnancies. They do not need to see what actually happens behind closed doors. The full implication of their chilling plan hit Marcus with the shock of cold water. They needed him to father their children, thereby creating the appearance of legitimate heirs, while the twins maintained complete control through marriages that would exist only on paper. You are asking me to commit an act that could get all of us killed, Marcus said slowly, the gravity of the situation clear. If anyone discovered— No one will discover, Catherine interrupted, her voice sharp with certainty. We control this household entirely. The marriages will be meticulously arranged. We'll manage every detail, every potential witness, every piece of evidence. You will be protected. Protected? Marcus laughed bitterly. I am a slave. There is no such thing as protection for me. If this fails, you will be socially ruined, perhaps sent away somewhere. I will be hanged or burned alive, which is precisely why you will be highly motivated to ensure it doesn't fail, Sarah said coolly. And in exchange, you will receive something that makes the risk worthwhile. What could possibly be worth freedom? Documented legal freedom and enough money to go north and start a new life, Catherine said quietly. We will wait until after the children are born and the estate is legally secured. Then we will manumit you, provide the funds, and send you away with a cover story that will withstand scrutiny. Marcus looked intensely between them, searching their expressions for any hint of deception or false promises. And if I refuse? You won't, Sarah said with absolute certainty. Because you want freedom more than you fear death, and you are smart enough to recognize this as your only real chance. She was right, and he knew it. But another motive was at play, one the twins hadn't considered. Marcus saw in their scheme not just a path to personal freedom, but a critical opportunity to document and expose the entire system. If he could gather definitive evidence about the Sutton family's horrifying secrets, about the Colonel's experiments, about the network of planters and overseers who had collaborated in decades of atrocities, he could send that explosive information north and strike a powerful blow against the institution that had stolen his life. I will do it, he said finally, on one condition. You are not in a position to make conditions, Catherine instantly retorted. I am. If you want my cooperation rather than my resentful compliance, I demand to know everything. Your father's journals, his correspondence, his breeding logs, all of it. If I am risking my life for this scheme, I deserve to understand the full context. The twins weighed the request carefully. Giving Marcus unrestricted access to their father's most damning papers was incredibly dangerous, but refusing might indeed lead to the resentful compliance he had mentioned. Agreed, Sarah conceded. But you will study them here in this room under our direct supervision. Nothing leaves this house. What none of them dared to voice aloud was that each had just entered into a desperate pact with someone they fundamentally did not trust, gambling their entire futures on a deception so audacious it could only succeed if every single element aligned perfectly. And in Lowndes County, Alabama, in 1847, perfection was a commodity in extremely short supply. The summer months brought oppressive, suffocating heat to Bell River, the kind of air that felt thick as syrup and made every physical task an exhausting ordeal. But inside the main house, behind carefully closed shutters and drawn curtains, a different kind of pressure began to build. Sarah and Catherine commenced their search for suitable husbands with the cold, precise calculation their father had instilled in them. They required men who satisfied the executive's stringent criteria for character and standing, while simultaneously being vulnerable enough to permit total manipulation. They compiled a preliminary list from Osgood's suggestions and their own observations of Lowndes County society. The first candidate was Mr. Edmund Varley, a 68-year-old widower whose cotton operation had been struggling since his sons moved west to seek opportunities in Texas. Varley had been a longtime friend of the Colonel and expressed immediate enthusiasm when approached about a potential match with one of the twins. A beautiful opportunity, he declared during his first visit to Bell River in July, his watery eyes roaming over Catherine with an expression that made her skin crawl. A union of two fine properties, continuation of your father's legacy. I'd be honored to guide you through the complexities of plantation management. Catherine smiled politely and said nothing. After Varley departed, she scrubbed her hands raw in the wash basin, desperate to remove the memory of his damp palm on her arm during the tour of the grounds. He'll do, Sarah assessed clinically. He's desperate to restore his reputation after last year's failed crop. He'll agree to any prenuptial terms to secure the connection. I can't, Catherine whispered, her voice strained. Sarah, I can't let him touch me. He won't, that is the entire point. The marriage is legal fiction. Marcus fathers the child, Varley takes the credit, and we maintain complete control. However, arranging two such specific marriages proved far more complicated than anticipated. The executives, particularly Breenage, held strong, restrictive opinions about suitable matches. When Sarah suggested she might marry a merchant from Mobile, a man of 42 with moderate success in the cotton trade, Breenage rejected him instantly. Unsuitable background, he declared. Your father intended you to marry into established planter families, not the commercial classes. The man's grandfather was an indentured servant, for God's sake. The twins attempted to push back, arguing that the will's language didn't specifically require planter families, only men of suitable character and standing. But Breenage remained firm, threatening to petition the courts to formally clarify the will's intent if they continued to propose inappropriate candidates. He's trying to force us into marriages that specifically benefit him, Sarah fumed after one particularly contentious meeting. He has sons, you realize. He's probably angling to marry one of us off into his own family. While the fraught marriage negotiations dragged on, Marcus fully immersed himself in Colonel Sutton's private papers. What he discovered there quickly exceeded his worst expectations. The Colonel's notorious breeding program had been operational for 2 decades with systematic, terrifying brutality. He had forced specific pairings, sold away children who failed to meet his arbitrary criteria, and ruthlessly separated families with zero consideration for human bonds. He documented everything in cold, clinical language that reduced people to mere data points. Female number 7 shows resistance to breeding assignments. Recommend increased discipline and isolation to induce compliance. But the journals also contain something else. Evidence of a network. The Colonel had not operated in isolation. He regularly corresponded with other wealthy planters, with medical professionals, and with academics at various southern universities. They frequently exchanged research findings, compared methodologies, and discussed strategies to advance their shared toxic theories about racial hierarchies and human improvement. Marcus began the painstaking process of making careful copies of the most damaging entries, utilizing the paper Sarah provided for household accounts and writing late into the night after the twins had retired. He devised a system for concealing his copied pages inside a hollowed-out section of his mattress, systematically building a secret archive that he intended to eventually carry north. However, he also began to observe something the twins had failed to mention: a disturbing pattern of illness among Bell River's enslaved population. In late July, 3 women in the quarters developed severe symptoms: lesions, persistent fever, and progressive weakness. Pritchett reported the cases casually, suggesting they simply be isolated and given minimal care until they either recovered or died. But Marcus had thoroughly read the Colonel's private medical notes and immediately recognized the disease he was seeing: syphilis. The Colonel had infected multiple women, either intentionally as part of his depraved research or through his systematic sexual abuse. Now the disease was spreading throughout the quarters, passing between couples and transmitted from mothers to their infants. Marcus presented his findings to Sarah and Catherine one evening, laying out the medical texts he had found alongside their father's chilling annotations. Your father gave them syphilis, he stated plainly. Either he contracted it himself and spread it, or he exposed them deliberately. The journals suggest both, and it is killing them. Catherine's face immediately went pale. How many? At least 7 are showing active symptoms now. But syphilis can remain dormant for years, Marcus explained. There's no way to know how many are truly infected without proper medical examination, and even then, He trailed off, the futility of the situation apparent. Sarah abruptly stood and walked to the window, her back held rigidly straight. "Can it be treated?" "Mercury treatments sometimes," he answered. "But they are almost as dangerous as the disease itself. And they are expensive, and would require a doctor willing to treat enslaved people properly." Marcus did not need to finish that sentence either. "Do it anyway," Sarah commanded without turning around. "Purchase whatever medicines are necessary from Mobile. Have a doctor come out, and if he refuses to treat them adequately, find someone who will." "Miss Sarah, the cost," Pritchett began to object. "I don't care about the cost," Sarah cut him off sharply. "Our father did this. We are not going to let them die from his depravity." It was the first significant crack in the twins' calculating facade Marcus had witnessed, the first indication that they might be motivated by something beyond mere self-preservation. He filed this observation away as valuable intelligence. Dr. Grayfield arrived 2 days later, visibly irritated at being summoned to treat slaves. He examined the sick women with barely concealed disgust, confirmed the terrible diagnosis, and prescribed mercury treatments with the cheerful indifference of someone who didn't particularly care whether the patient survived. "Course of treatment takes months," he noted, washing his hands in the basin a house servant provided. "Can't guarantee results. Frankly, it might be more economical to just isolate them and let nature take its course. Replace them with healthy stock." "We will take your prescription," Catherine said icily, "and we will need you to examine the entire slave population. Everyone. Identify all potential cases." Grayfield's eyebrows shot up. "That's 40+ people. The expense is ours to bear. When can you begin?" The mandatory examinations took place over 3 grueling days in August, conducted in a cabin Pritchett had reluctantly cleared for the purpose. Grayfield worked with mechanical efficiency, noting symptoms in a ledger and dispensing diagnoses with the cold bedside manner of a livestock inspector. The final count was worse than Marcus had feared. 14 confirmed cases with another 8 probable. Nearly a third of Belle River's enslaved population had been infected as a direct result of the colonel's systematic abuse. Sarah and Catherine absorbed this devastating information in silence. Then Sarah made a definitive decision that would have simultaneously shocked their father and confused their neighbors. "We are treating all of them," she announced. "Purchase the mercury, the bandages, whatever else is needed. Improved rations for the sick. They need strength to survive the treatment. Reduced work quotas. And Marcus, you will oversee the treatments. Keep detailed records of who receives what and their progress." "Miss Sarah," Pritchett immediately objected, "this is going to cost thousands of dollars and reduce productivity significantly." "Your father would never." "Our father did this to them," Catherine interrupted, her eyes flashing with fury. "We are correcting his damage. The expense is irrelevant." What the twins did not articulate even to each other was the complex, layered motivation behind this costly decision. Partially, it was cold pragmatism. Dead slaves couldn't work, and the plantation's value was directly tied to its labor force. Partially, it was genuine guilt, recognizing their complicity in their father's monstrous system, even as his secondary victims. But partially, it was something deeper, something neither wanted to examine too closely. The sudden, horrifying recognition that their father's greatest crime was not just the specific atrocities he committed, but his core, fundamental belief that other people existed only as instruments for his own purposes. They had been raised to think the exact same way. Now confronted with the overwhelming human cost of that worldview, they were being forcibly compelled to choose what kind of people they would ultimately become. Marcus watched these complex developments with growing confusion. He had arrived at Belle River expecting to find predictable monsters, people who viewed him as less than human. Instead, he had found 2 women who had been twisted by their father's abuse and who were now struggling fiercely to untangle their own humanity from the poison he had fed them. This did not magically make them allies, nor did it earn his trust, but it complicated his simple, neat narrative of oppressor and oppressed in ways that made his documentation work far more challenging. While Marcus wrestled with this moral complexity, the crucial marriage negotiations reached a crisis point. In September, Breenage arrived at Belle River with a ready-made proposal. His nephew, Thomas Breenage, age 34, who had recently returned from New Orleans after his cotton brokerage failed, due to what was delicately termed Unfortunate investments. Thomas desperately needed a fresh start and a wealthy connection. Sarah needed a husband the executives would readily approve. Perfect match, Breenage declared, having clearly already decided the matter. Thomas has impeccable breeding, understands plantation management, and will provide the steady male guidance you require. Sarah met Thomas twice before reaching her conclusion. He was weak, vain, and deeply in debt, which to her mind made him perfect for her purposes. I will agree to the match, she told Breenage, under specific conditions, a prenuptial contract giving me sole management of Bell River. Thomas receives an annual income but absolutely no decision-making authority over plantation operations. And the marriage does not take place until my sister's match is also arranged. Those terms are highly irregular, Breenage spluttered. Those terms are non-negotiable, Sarah replied with finality. Thomas is desperate enough to agree. We both know it. Breenage sputtered again but could not argue with her accurate assessment. Thomas did agree, signing a prenuptial contract that effectively made him a paid figurehead in exchange for immediate respectability and freedom from his creditors. Catherine's match proved far more difficult. Edmund Varley had grown impatient and shifted his attention to a wealthy widow in Montgomery. The executives rejected 3 subsequent candidates for various arbitrary reasons. Time was quickly running short. They had until February 1849, and it was already October 1847. Then Catherine made a revolutionary suggestion that completely changed their course of action. What if I don't marry at all? Sarah looked up sharply from the ledgers they had been reviewing. The will requires both of us to marry within 24 months. The will requires both of us to marry within 24 months. Catherine corrected, meeting her gaze. It says nothing about remaining married. I could marry, become pregnant, and then accidents happen, especially to sickly husbands. The room fell into a heavy silence. Marcus, seated at the desk where he had been copying correspondence, felt a sudden chill run down his spine. You're suggesting murder, he said quietly. I'm suggesting that we fulfill the letter of Father's will through whatever means necessary, Catherine replied evenly. He never stipulated that the husbands had to survive. Catherine, Sarah began, a warning tone in her voice. Don't pretend you haven't thought about it, Catherine challenged. Thomas Breenage is going to be a problem. He's weak, but he's not stupid. Once you're married, he'll try to assert authority, pregnancy or not. Men like that always do. They can't help themselves. Sarah didn't offer a rebuttal, which served as her answer. Marcus understood in that precise moment that he had severely miscalculated the twins' character. He had viewed them as victims of their circumstances, trapped women trying to escape their father's control through desperate means. But they were their father's daughters in ways that went deeper than mere blood. They had learned to view people as obstacles to be managed or ruthlessly removed. If you are planning to kill anyone, Marcus said carefully, I want no part of it. That is not what I agreed to. You agreed to do what we say, Catherine reminded him, her voice hard. And you will keep doing it because the alternative is being sold south, remember? Then sell me south. I won't be party to murder. The twins exchanged meaningful glances. Sarah spoke first, her voice softening slightly. Catherine is talking theoretically. We are not planning to kill anyone, but she is right that we need to consider all possibilities. This situation is far more complicated than we initially anticipated. Marcus didn't believe her, but he also recognized he had no viable options. If he outright refused to cooperate, they could indeed sell him away, and his critical documentation would be lost forever. If he reported their nascent plans to the authorities, his word, that of an enslaved person, would be instantly dismissed against that of white women, and he would likely be executed for daring to make such accusations. So he did what enslaved people had always done to survive. He nodded, agreed to the terms, and immediately began planning how to protect himself when the inevitable violence arrived. November brought the first frost and a new, concrete development. Sarah's wedding to Thomas Breenage was officially scheduled for December 15th. The ceremony was to be held at Bell River, with Reverend Yates officiating. Catherine would serve as maid of honor, and the estate executives would attend to witness the fulfillment of the first condition of the will. But behind the scenes of the wedding preparations, darker plans continued to take shape. Sarah and Marcus began their physical relationship in early November. These were clinical encounters that took place in the locked study after Catherine had retired. Sarah approached the act with the same cold, analytical efficiency she applied to plantation management. This was strictly reproduction, not intimacy, a necessary biological function to achieve a goal. Marcus found the experience profoundly disturbing, not primarily because of the severe racial taboo they were violating, though that danger hung heavily over every encounter, but because of the deep emotional emptiness of it, the way Sarah could completely separate physical acts from any pretense of human connection. "My father did this to dozens of women," she confessed one night. Afterward, as they lay separately on the study floor, "Forced them into exactly this situation. And I swore I'd never be like him. Yet here I am." "You're not forcing me," Marcus said, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. "The threat of being sold south was pervasive, aren't I? You are enslaved. By definition, you cannot truly consent. I tell myself this is different because I'm offering you freedom afterward, because we're partners in this deception. But we're not partners. I own you. There is no consent possible in that dynamic." It was the most brutally honest thing she had ever said to him. And it made everything worse because it meant she understood exactly what she was doing, and did it anyway. By mid-November, Sarah was pregnant. Dr. Grayfield confirmed it during a routine visit to check on the syphilis treatments. The executives were elated. One condition satisfied, only one more to go. Thomas Breenage, who had arrived at Bell River 2 weeks earlier to prepare for the wedding, accepted the news with the oblivious pleasure of a man who believed his own virility explained everything. Catherine's situation remained unresolved. She had rejected 6 potential husbands, frustrating the executives and allowing the calendar to run dangerously close to the deadline. Then in early December, she made an announcement. "I've found someone acceptable. Mr. Lawrence Kemper, widower, age 51, with a small plantation in Wilcox County. Moderate means, respectable reputation, no children from his first marriage. I'll need to meet him," Breenage stated. "Of course, he'll visit next week." Lawrence Kemper arrived on December 8th. He was a thin, nervous man with graying hair and a persistent cough that strongly suggested consumption. He spoke very little, constantly deferred to Catherine, and seemed pathetically grateful for her attention. "He's perfect," Catherine told Marcus after Kemper left. "Dying slowly, desperate for companionship, and too weak to assert any authority. The executives will approve him because he meets their surface criteria, and he'll be dead within a year, leaving me a widow free to do as I please." "You're going to let him die of consumption?" "I'm going to let nature take its course." "Is that murder, Marcus? Marrying a sick man knowing he won't survive?" Marcus had no answer. That thin distinction did not sound like a moral evasion. Sarah's wedding took place on a cold, clear December day. 40 guests attended, filling Bell River's parlor with the heavy smell of perfume and wood smoke from the fireplaces. Reverend Yates performed the ceremony with his usual ponderous solemnity. Thomas Breenage looked smugly pleased with himself, clearly believing he had secured a valuable prize. Sarah wore a dress of ivory silk that Catherine had sewn, and her expression throughout the ceremony was as blank as a porcelain doll's. Marcus watched from the back of the room, ostensibly serving as additional household staff for the event. He watched Sarah speak her vows without hesitation. He watched her accept Thomas's kiss with perfect composure. He watched her smile and accept congratulations from guests who had absolutely no idea what kind of horrific performance they were witnessing. That night, after the guests had finally departed and Thomas had drunk himself into a stupor in his new quarters, Sarah came to the study where Marcus waited. "It's done," she said simply. "The first condition is satisfied, and Thomas will do as he's told. I made that very clear during our wedding night conversation. He gets a comfortable life, an annual income, and the appearance of authority. In exchange, he stays out of my way and doesn't ask questions about how this plantation operates." He agreed to that. He agreed to avoid being exposed as a fraud who embezzled from his business partners in New Orleans. "I purchased his cooperation with threats, Marcus. The same way I purchased yours. I'm my father's daughter, remember?" The bitterness in her voice was new and, to Marcus, intensely dangerous. Sarah was sinking into self-loathing over what she was becoming, a dangerous state that meant she might either do something wildly unpredictable to prove she was fundamentally different from her father, or something utterly terrible to demonstrate she no longer cared. Catherine's wedding was scheduled for January 20th, 1848. The Executives approved Lawrence Kemper after only minimal scrutiny. His background checked out, his property holdings were legitimate, and his desperate eagerness to remarry completely blinded them to any potential underlying issues. However, in the weeks between the two weddings, something critical shifted at Bell River. The house staff began whispering about fierce arguments between the twins, reporting raised voices behind closed doors. Pritchett noted that both women seemed distracted and unfocused, often making decisive plantation management choices, only to countermand them hours later. Marcus understood the cause, the extreme strain of maintaining their massive deception, coupled with Sarah's increasing self-hatred and Catherine's steadily colder calculation, was fracturing their previously united front. The tension violently erupted the night before Catherine's wedding. Marcus was in the study, working on his secret documentation when he heard sudden screams from upstairs. He rushed up to find Sarah and Catherine in Sarah's bedroom. Catherine was bleeding from her nose, and Sarah had visible scratch marks on her face. "She wants to kill him!" Sarah shouted the moment she saw Marcus. "Not just let him die, actually poison him. He's dying anyway." Catherine screamed back, enraged. "Why wait? Why risk him changing his mind about the marriage terms? We dose him with arsenic. He's dead in 6 months. I'm a widow and pregnant, and we're finally done with all of this. Because that makes us murderers. Actual deliberate murderers." "We're already murderers," Catherine retorted, her voice filled with chilling contempt. "Or had you forgotten the coffee you served Father the night he died?" The room went instantly silent. Marcus stared at the twins, understanding rushing through him with sickening, terrible clarity. "You killed your father," he stated, his voice flat. Sarah sank onto the bed, burying her face in her hands. Arsenic mixed with powdered glass in his coffee. Small amounts over 3 weeks made it perfectly resemble heart failure. Dr. Grayfield never suspected because he wanted to believe it was natural causes. "We had to," Catherine said, her voice fiercely defiant. "He was going to sell Marcus and 3 other slaves to a trader from Mississippi. We overheard him finalizing the arrangements, and he was also planning to force us into marriages with men he had pre-selected. Men who would have helped him continue his breeding program. We had no choice." "There's always a choice," Marcus said quietly. "Easy for you to say," Catherine snapped back. "You're not trapped in a cage built by a man who viewed you as a biological experiment." "I'm trapped in a cage too, just a different kind," Marcus countered. "And I've never killed anyone to escape it." The intense argument was cut short by the sound of footsteps on the main stairs, Thomas stumbling drunkenly toward his wife's bedroom. The 3 conspirators instantly fell silent, listening to him curse loudly as he fumbled with the door handle, then eventually give up and shuffle heavily away. After Thomas was gone, Sarah spoke quietly. "We can't do this again, Catherine. If you poison Lawrence, it's over. Someone will notice. Someone will investigate. And all of this, the plantation, our freedom, Marcus's documentation, all of it will be destroyed. Then what do you suggest?" "We're running out of time. We wait. We let nature take its course with Lawrence. We endure. And when it's finally over, when we've satisfied Father's conditions and permanently secured the inheritance, then we decide who we want to be." Catherine did not answer immediately. When she finally did, her voice sounded utterly exhausted. "I don't know if I can endure anymore. I don't know if there's anything left of me to save." Marcus, watching them, realized he had been meticulously documenting the wrong story. He had focused intensely on the Colonel's well-documented atrocities, the systematic abuse, the breeding program. But the real horror of Bell River wasn't merely what had been done to enslaved people, horrific as that was. It was what had been done to the twins themselves, the way their father had twisted them into dangerous weapons and then aimed them, ultimately at each other. They were simultaneous victims and perpetrators, trapped in roles they hadn't chosen but were now performing with increasing desperation. And Marcus was trapped right alongside them, his own survival dependent on a scheme that seemed more likely every day to end in catastrophic violence. Catherine's wedding to Lawrence Kemper took place on January 20th, 1848. A smaller affair with only 20 guests. Kemper looked skeletal, his persistent cough severely worsening in the January cold. He needed Catherine's physical support just to walk to the parlor where Reverend Yates waited. The rushed ceremony lasted only 12 minutes. When Yates pronounced them married, Kemper attempted to kiss his bride but was immediately seized by a violent coughing fit. that left a distinct trace of blood on his handkerchief. "Consumption's got him good," Dr. Grayfield muttered darkly to Breenidge. "Give him 6 months, maybe less." Lawrence Kemper moved into Bell River that evening, taking a separate bedroom far removed from Catherine's. He seemed pathetically grateful for every small kindness, repeatedly thanking the servants for bringing him water and stoking his fire. Catherine and Marcus began their clinical encounters in early February. Unlike Sarah's conflicted honesty, Catherine treated the act as purely another transaction to be completed efficiently. She scheduled specific times, and afterward, she instantly departed without any conversation. By March, Catherine was pregnant. Lawrence Kemper, now confined entirely to his bed by his worsening illness, accepted the news with confused, simple pleasure. "Thank God," he wheezed weakly. "You'll have something to remember me by." The executives visited in April to formally verify both pregnancies. They found everything strictly in order. Both twins married, both confirmed pregnant, and cotton production maintained at expected levels. Breenidge pronounced himself fully satisfied. Meanwhile, Marcus spent his nights meticulously documenting everything. He now possessed irrefutable evidence of the Colonel's breeding program, the subsequent syphilis epidemic, the poisoning of their father, and the complicated marriage scheme. His primary problem remained finding a secure way to smuggle these crucial documents north without being intercepted. In May, a traveling preacher named Jacob Sturgis arrived, ostensibly collecting missionary donations. During dinner, Sturgis made a pointed mention of spending time in Philadelphia, a known center for abolitionist activity. Marcus cautiously made a small hand gesture, a recognized sign used by Underground Railroad operatives. Sturgis briefly paused mid-sentence, his eyes flickering toward Marcus, then continued without breaking character. Later, Marcus discreetly approached him near the stable. "I have documents, evidence of severe crimes. It needs to reach Philadelphia." After careful consideration, Sturgis cautiously agreed. Marcus spent the next 10 days copying his most essential documentation onto thin paper, writing in a microscopic hand. He meticulously recorded the Colonel's experiments, the forced breeding, the spreading syphilis epidemic, the deliberate poisoning, and his own complex role in the twins' entire scheme. He then enlisted Isaiah, a trusted field worker, to deliver the finalized documents to Sturgis in Selma. 2 weeks later, Isaiah returned, confirming successful delivery. Marcus felt an intense mix of liberation and sheer terror. The evidence now existed outside the twins' immediate control, but if discovered, he was a dead man. Summer brought mounting tension to Bell River. Sarah's pregnancy progressed normally, though she grew increasingly withdrawn and isolated. Thomas Breenidge took to heavy drinking, while Lawrence Kemper lingered in his sick room, cared for by patient servants. Then, surprisingly, Sarah began visiting Lawrence, bringing him books. He revealed to her that he had once been a teacher before inheriting a plantation. He never learned how to manage properly. "I'm just a school teacher who wanted to read books," he confessed weakly. "Is that so terrible?" Sarah had no immediate answer for him. On August 17, 1848, Lawrence Kemper quietly died in his sleep from consumption. He was buried 3 days later, his brief presence memorialized by a simple headstone inscribed, "Lawrence Kemper, 1797-1848. He found peace at the end. Catherine was now a pregnant widow, and the 2 major conditions of the will were fulfilled. Yet Lawrence's death seemed to affect Catherine deeply, instilling a genuine sense of guilt despite the fact that she hadn't actively killed him. In mid-September, an unexpected woman arrived, claiming to be the Colonel's estranged half-sister, and threatening severe lawsuits unless she was granted a large cash settlement. The twins immediately recognized her as a fraud, but before they could act, she approached Pritchett with a blatant bribery offer. Pritchett, demonstrating unexpected loyalty, immediately reported the incident to the twins. Armed with this evidence, Sarah and Catherine confronted the fraud and her lawyer in Hayneville. The meeting was brief and brutally effective. The pair promptly left Alabama within 24 hours, but the incident painfully revealed the twins' continued vulnerability. Until the babies were safely born, they remained exposed targets. In late October, the entire scheme nearly collapsed. Thomas Breenidge, drunk after winning a card game, carelessly mentioned that Sarah had been pregnant within mere weeks of their marriage, citing the surprisingly quick timing. The scandalized word spread throughout Lowndes County within days. Breenage, the executive, arrived at Bell River demanding immediate explanations. Sarah made a calculated final decision. Standing before a group of prominent neighbors, 7 months pregnant, she delivered a calm, calculated confession. "I was violated," she said steadily, maintaining direct eye contact. "Before our marriage, Thomas and I were intimately involved. I became pregnant. Rather than cancel the marriage and face ruin, we proceeded with the ceremony. It was wrong, it was sinful, but it does not invalidate our Father's will." The assembled men exchanged uncomfortable glances. Premarital intimacy was scandalous, but not entirely unprecedented. Sarah's frank, steady admission made the outrageous story believable, a plausible lie designed to protect the far greater deception underneath. "What about your sister?" Breenage asked skeptically. "Catherine's situation is entirely proper," Sarah assured him. Breenage studied her face carefully but lacked any concrete evidence to disprove her prepared story. "This matter is closed," he finally declared. "The will's conditions have been met." After everyone had left, Sarah finally collapsed in the parlor, her fierce composure utterly broken. Sarah went into labor on November 14, 1848. The labor lasted 18 grueling hours. At dawn on November 15th, a baby's sharp cry finally pierced the morning silence. "A girl," the midwife announced, "small but healthy." Sarah lay utterly exhausted against the pillows, her daughter wrapped in blankets beside her. The baby had dark hair and ambiguous features, perfectly useful in a house constructed upon lies. "She's free," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "That's all that matters." Catherine delivered on December 7th after 12 difficult hours, the umbilical cord wrapped dangerously around the baby's neck. The midwife worked with calm efficiency until a weak cry confirmed the baby's survival. "Another girl," she said. "She's a fighter." Catherine looked at her daughter, who was visibly darker than Sarah's child, with features that would require careful future explanation. "I'm calling her Ruth," she announced, "after our mother." "And mine will be Abigail," Sarah said through tears, "after the grandmother we never knew." The names deliberately honored the women their monster father had tried to erase. They were the first decisions the twins had ever made that were not calculated for advantage. They were simply mothers naming their daughters. The executors visited on December 20th to formally verify both births and finalize the estate transfer. Breenage examined the infants clinically, noted their existence, and pronounced the will's complex conditions fully satisfied. Bell River Plantation is hereby transferred to Sarah Breenage and Catherine Kemper. The estate is officially closed. After he left, Sarah felt nothing. No triumph, no relief, only profound exhaustion. They had won, but the immense cost had been paid in blood and moral compromise. Marcus entered carrying Abigail. "She wants her mother." As Sarah took her daughter, she made a sudden, definitive decision. "We're keeping our promise. Your manumission papers will be filed next week, funds sufficient to reach Philadelphia and establish yourself there." Marcus had expected inevitable delays, and the directness caught him completely off guard. "Just like that?" "We made an agreement. I am honoring it. And the documents I sent north." Sarah's eyes narrowed dangerously. "I know about those. Pritchett intercepts all correspondence. I know what was in them. Everything about Father's programs, the poisoning, our arrangement. Then why didn't you?" "Because you were right to document it. Someone needs to tell the truth. Maybe your testimony will reach people who can actually change things." Catherine appeared carrying Ruth. "We're not stopping you, but we are asking for 6 months. Stay until June. Help stabilize operations. Then leave with our blessing and enough money to start fresh." It was masterful manipulation, but also fiercely honest. 6 months, Marcus agreed. The winter passed in comparative peace. The syphilis treatments continued, with several individuals making full recoveries. The twins settled into their new roles as mothers while efficiently maintaining plantation operations. Marcus spent his evenings meticulously preparing for his departure, but found himself increasingly reluctant to leave. He had developed a genuine attachment to the children he had fathered, and had reached a complex understanding of the twins themselves, victims attempting to escape their victimhood, desperately trying to be better than they had been raised to be. In March, a letter finally arrived from Pennsylvania, addressed to Marcus. It was from Jacob Sturgis, The testimony had successfully reached the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. They were compiling it into a scathing public report on Alabama plantations. "Father's legacy will be exposure and condemnation," Sarah said quietly. "Everything he believed will be used as evidence of the system's depravity." "He was a monster," Marcus said. "I know," Sarah replied, her voice soft with lingering pain. "But he was also my father." They moved Marcus's official departure up to mid-April. The night before he left, Sarah called him to the study. "I've been thinking about what we did," she confessed. "We convinced ourselves we were different from Father because we offered you freedom. But we weren't different. We just used more sophisticated coercion." "I know." "And yet you stayed the extra months, completed the treatments. You fulfilled your bargain even after you knew I discovered your documentation." Sarah handed him a satchel heavy with gold coins. "This is more than we agreed." Inside were also detailed letters of introduction to merchants who would not question a freed slave with proper papers. "Why?" he asked. "Because Abigail and Ruth will ask about their father someday. I want to tell them he was a good man who made difficult choices, who documented the truth when others wanted it buried." Catherine appeared with both babies. "We're saying goodbye properly, as families should." Marcus held his two daughters one last time, memorizing their tiny faces. "Be good," he whispered. "Be better than all of us." Marcus left Bell River on April 18, 1849. He carried his documents and a daguerreotype. Sarah had secretly commissioned a portrait of him holding both little girls on his back. Marcus and his daughters, April 1849. May they all find freedom. He reached Mobile and secured passage north. The ship departed on April 23rd. He never returned to Alabama, but his testimony did. The Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society published their damning report in July 1849, detailing the horrific plantation conditions and explicitly naming Colonel Nathaniel Sutton. It caused instant outrage in northern states and ferocious fury in southern ones. In August, Harold Breenidge began asking aggressive questions about how Bell River's private information had reached Pennsylvania. On September 3rd, he arrived with a sheriff and a legal warrant to search for evidence of abolitionist activity. Marcus was manumitted. Sarah replied calmly. "He left with our blessing. Whatever he did afterward is his business. He stole property, your father's journals." "My father's journals passed to us," Catherine countered. "We gave Marcus access as part of his household duties. What he did with that access is mere speculation." The exhaustive search lasted 3 hours. They found nothing. Catherine had deliberately burned everything potentially incriminating weeks earlier. Breenidge was finally forced to leave empty-handed, though his parting words carried a clear threat. "This isn't over. Eventually someone will find the truth." After he left, Catherine said simply, "We need to disappear." It took 6 weeks to execute their final escape. They sold Bell River quickly for immediate cash, manumitted several key enslaved people with funds to establish themselves, and sold the remaining population to a Quaker merchant who had promised to transport them to free states. Thomas Breenidge received his prearranged property in cash settlement for agreeing never to contest the sale. On October 14, 1849, Sarah and Catherine boarded a ship in Mobile bound for New Orleans, traveling as respectable widows with infant daughters. But before leaving Alabama forever, they made one final destructive stop. On October 15th, a massive fire started in the Hayneville courthouse basement. The building burned for 6 hours, collapsing before dawn. 3 bodies were eventually found, identified as vagrants seeking shelter, though no one looked carefully at why they had been chained in the basement. The investigation concluded an overturned lamp caused the accidental fire. Most county records from 1847 to 1849 were completely destroyed. Anyone trying to trace Bell River's precise history would find only fragments and frustrating gaps. Sarah and Catherine reached Wisconsin in December 1849. They purchased a small farm outside Madison using false identities, presenting themselves as widowed sisters starting over. Their daughters grew up knowing only that their mothers had come from Alabama, had successfully escaped difficult circumstances, and that their father had been a good man who had made great sacrifices. Marcus successfully established himself in Philadelphia as a respected bookkeeper. He never married, never had other children, and never spoke publicly about Alabama, but he continued to provide crucial testimony, and helped transport escaped slaves until the Civil War began. He kept the daguerreotype hidden, taking it out only occasionally to look at his daughters' faces. In 1863, a Union lieutenant discovered a sealed trunk in Belle River's ruins, containing journals and breeding logs that tragically confirmed everything in the report and added new, horrifying details. These documents became a key part of the case for the complete abolition of slavery. Colonel Nathaniel Sutton's legacy became exactly what his daughters had predicted: exposure, condemnation, and irrefutable evidence of systematic evil. But the full, complicated truth about Sarah and Catherine, about Marcus and the two children, remained safely hidden in burned records and carefully constructed lies. The courthouse fire was never truly solved. The 3 bodies were never identified. The crucial documents were never recovered. And the truth about the Alabama twin sisters who shared one male slave until they both got pregnant remained buried in ash and silence for over a century. Some historians claim this story is entirely fabricated, arguing that no records exist to support the alleged events. Others point directly to the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society's report and argue that where there's contemporary documentation, there is a fundamental truth. But perhaps the full verifiability of every detail doesn't matter. What fundamentally matters is what the story reveals about the system that made such horrific events not only possible, but tragically inevitable. A system built on treating human beings as property, on using violence and deception as core tools of control. The Sutton twins, if they existed, were both victims and desperate perpetrators. Marcus, if he lived, was both unwilling collaborator and courageous resistance fighter. The children inherited a complex legacy of trauma and survival, guilt and fierce resilience. And the rest of us inherit the solemn responsibility to remember, to examine, and to ensure that the conditions that created such horrors never exist again.